Oh boy, it's been a minute, hasn't it, old map friend? Yeah, it's been far too long since we made a new state for our map, so I want to do something special for you all for being so patient and waiting between episodes here. I want to head outside, find the next tree for our map, get a good piece of wood from it, and make our next state right there on location next to the tree itself. So let's go hit the road.
All right, I've loaded up the truck and we are on the road to make the next piece for our US Tree Map Volume 2. If you're new here, I'm making a map of the US where each state is made out of wood from a different interesting native tree. No official state trees since I've already done that. But we're not just making map pieces in this series, I'm also showing you all the different amazing and interesting things that you can make out of the wood, the fruit, the nuts, and everything else that these trees provide. Up today, it's my home, the great state of Utah, which was the very first piece from the original official state tree map when I made it out of a really excellent piece of quaking aspen. This time, Miles and I are on the hunt for a piece of wood from a tree that'll give us some beautiful wood for the map and might also help us bake the perfect loaf of sourdough. More on that later. So what is this tree we're seeking? Well, it's none other than the Utah juniper, Juniperus utahensis. It's the single most widespread species of tree in the entire state, so it shouldn't be too difficult to find a nice piece of it, but to be safe, I'm headed to a piece of private property that I have permission to harvest on that's absolutely covered in Utah juniper trees with a lot of big dead standing ones to choose from. And hey, we've got a perfect candidate right here. There's some really good looking stuff in the main trunk area, so after clearing away some of the limbs, I went to work on cutting a few planks to choose from.
Where'd the third one go? Ah, fell down here. We've got 3. Let's make a state.
Now, thanks to the magic of selective editing, this rough-sawn field-collected piece of juniper wood is nice and planed and ready for us to set up the scroll saw in the shade of a gorgeous living Utah juniper tree.
What do you say, Miles? What do you say? Good boy. So what I like to do is use the spray glue to glue it onto painter's tape instead of directly onto our piece of wood, and that helps us avoid the hassle of sticky residue from the spray glue sticking to the wood. Lay out enough tape to cover the state of Utah. We're on location and I brought only one scroll saw blade, so if this breaks, we're in trouble. It's really nice to be out here amongst nature, but the garage sure helps with the wind. We don't mind, do we, Miles? Don't worry, I'm picking all this up. Peeling. Okay. Now we, don't want to cut too close to the border. I'm gonna give ourselves some breathing room. This is a very complicated shape too, so I have to really be technically precise with my cuts here. This is very difficult. Okay, there we go.
The Utah juniper, scientific name Juniperus utahensis or Juniperus osteosperma, is an iconic plant to the western interior. It's a tree that comes in all shapes and sizes, from the anonymous, almost shrub-like plants that blanket the foothills of the Great Basin Mountains, to twisting, ancient sculptures that grow out of red rock cliffs on the Colorado Plateau. For this map, this tree was a no-brainer choice. Not only is it right there in the name of the tree, but this is the most predominant species in the state. Nearly 1/5 of the land area in Utah is covered by the Utah juniper. And that's thanks in large part because this tree is able to grow and thrive in some of the most inhospitable landscapes the US has to offer. Intense heat, frigid cold, very little water, high winds. In places where little else can grow, you'll find this tree thriving. A lot of its success is thanks to a massive underground root system with deep tap roots that grow straight down in search of water. Other things that make this tree a survivor is it grows real slowly and also exhibits compartmentalization, a practice in which it self-prunes huge portions of the tree in order to optimize its use of resources. It's not uncommon to find a massive Utah juniper that's mostly just dead wood with a single ribbon of living tissue that leads to the tree's sole cluster of branches adorned with green needles. As for its many uses, let's first talk about its wood. It's extremely rot resistant thanks to its high levels of natural oils and compounds that repel insects, fungi, and other wood decaying organisms. This also makes it an excellent firewood, some of the best smelling around if you ask me. It also has ancient and modern use as a construction material for fence posts, lodge and hut construction. It's also used to make traditional indigenous items like drums, flutes, bows, and bowls. The tree's stringy bark can be used to make all sorts of things: baskets, rope, sandals, floor coverings, roof thatching, and more. And some of the many ceremonial and medicinal uses of the tree include making infusions or boiled extracts of branches, twigs, needles, and the tree's berry-like cones. These were all used to treat maladies like hemorrhages, stomach aches, headaches, menstrual cramps, colds and fevers, heart trouble, kidney trouble, just to name a few of the things that juniper decoctions can be used to treat. We're really just scratching the surface here, and one of my favorite things about junipers by far are those edible berries. I've used some of them to make candy on this channel and ice cream on a YouTube short. This time I've got something totally different I want to try. But before we get into all that, our Utah Juniper Utah is all done, cut and sanded down here next to the aromatic blue wisps of juniper wood smoke. Couldn't ask for a better evening than this right here. And I mean, look at this piece, all that figure and curl. The oil is really getting the color of that juniper wood to pop. Just gorgeous. I can't wait to add this to the map, but first, I can't wait to tell you more about my big juniper berry experiment. Let's go find a tree.
This beautiful, enormous tree behind me is teeming with juniper berries, which are actually cones. In fact, this tree has two types of cones on it, which is how we know that this is a Utah juniper. Throughout most of Utah, you have two types of junipers that share the native range: the Utah juniper, which we have here, and the Rocky Mountain juniper. There are a lot of ways to distinguish between those two trees. The needles of a Utah juniper are more of a green-yellow, whereas the Rocky Mountain juniper has more of a blue-green. A Utah juniper's crown is usually a bit more wide and open as opposed to a Rocky Mountain juniper that has more of a narrow crown, but those can both be a little bit misleading. I've seen a lot of Utah junipers that have more of a blue-green color. I've seen younger Utah junipers can appear more conical. The surefire way to tell the difference between the two is by looking at the cones. Now, these juniper berries that we know and love, these are actually the seed or female cones, whereas the male pollen cones on a juniper are much, much smaller. They're these tiny little brown things you see at the end of the needles here. So the Utah juniper is an example of a tree that is monoecious, meaning that the male and female cones or flowers are on the same tree, whereas the Rocky Mountain juniper is an example of a tree that is dioecious, meaning that the female cones or flowers are on one tree and the male cones or flowers are on another tree. Now, I love juniper berries for a bunch of reasons. For one, they just look so cool. I love the color of them. I love the shape of them. They got these cool little spiky horn thingies. You are positively covered in berries right now, my friend. Look at all this good stuff. Again, these berries are edible. You just pop them in your mouth and spit out a seed. These berries have that classic juniper flavor that is used in flavoring gin. The berries of the Utah juniper tree aren't really used for that purpose though. That honor goes primarily to the common juniper. It tends to give that more consistent gin-like flavor, whereas the berries of the Utah juniper tree can be more unpredictable, sometimes imparting a very bitter flavor to the party. So the berries are primarily used by weirdos like me who like to play around with tree-flavored stuff. But one really cool thing about these berries is that the true color of a juniper berry on a Utah juniper, as you remove the outer bloom, is quite green. Now this really lovely bluish, whitish color, you know what that is wild yeast. And what I would like to use these for today is, let's make a sourdough starter. Come on, buddy. Okay. Lucky for us, growing right next door to this Utah juniper is a beautiful antelope bitterbrush tree. Look at this thing. This is so cool. A highly underrated tree-like shrub that is one of my personal favorites. And a reason this is such a happy coincidence is that sometimes, down at the base of a antelope bitterbrush, you can often find, let's just dig around these roots here, down the root network, you can find wildflower. Now this is wildflower, F-L-O-U-R, which just happens to be exactly what we need for our sourdough starter. And let's dig around down here, and oh, I think I see something. Oh yeah, oh, check that out. A perfect specimen. Let's make some sourdough starter. Now let's just pick a few of these here. We don't need many. We just need enough to borrow some of this lovely wild yeast. Just pop the top off of our flour jar. Drop our juniper berries in there. Get them good and mixed in. Add equal parts water, fresh out of a scale here, so we're just gonna do our best. And stir. Now, is there enough wild yeast just in the air and already in this flour that I could just add water to flour, mix that together, and make a sourdough starter that way? Yes, of course I could. But is it undeniably more fun to add juniper berries to flour and make a sourdough starter that way? I posit that yes, it is. I like to believe that the wild yeast that congregated on those juniper berries chose to do so because they have exceptionally good vibes. They like trees, they like junipers. I like to believe that's going to translate into a superior loaf of sourdough. Let's find out together.
Quick side note, there are two species of juniper whose berries are toxic when consumed. The savin juniper, Juniperus sabina, and the cade juniper or prickly juniper, Juniperus oxycedrus. I'm unsure if harvesting the yeast from them would cause issues or not, but it's probably just safest to avoid them if you can. Okay, I'm back home with my starter. It looks pretty gnarly right now, but I'm not going to sweat it. It's just time for a regular feeding. Add some water, mix that together, add the same weight and flour that I did water, stir that all together, and then repeat this process again tomorrow, discarding any excess if the jar gets too full. And within a few days, things are really moving in there. Our wild yeast friends are at work. That's how we know we've got just the kind of starter activity we're looking for. So I'm going to drop a pinchful in some water and it floats. So this is officially ready to use to make some bread. Okay, so our juniper berry wild yeast sourdough starter is ripe and ready to go. So how do we turn this into bread? Well, it starts with what's called an autolyse. That's this right here. This is a mix of about 850 grams of bread flour with 150 grams of whole wheat flour. That whole wheat flour is just going to give a little bit more structure and flavor. Mix that together with 750 grams of warm water and let it sit for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Basically, an autolyse allows the flour to fully hydrate. Some of those enzymes start to break down. It just makes it easier to shape and gives it extra flavor later on. But at this point, all we need to do now is add yeast in the form of our wild yeast sourdough starter. So how is a sourdough starter different from, say, a packet of dry yeast? Well, for one, this contains a combination of wild yeast and also lactic acid bacteria. Active dry yeast, by comparison, usually contains just a single strain of cultivated yeast. So that lactic acid really gives the sourdough bread that distinct tangy flavor. The wild yeast strains are going to also bring some unique elements to the party, and it also ferments much more slowly. As you'll see here in the next steps, we ferment this over the course of several hours. Helps not only give it that distinct flavor, but also that very unique consistency of the crumb. Granted, I'm not an expert here, but that's a very brief overview as to what's going on. So at this point, we're just going to add our wild yeast starter directly to the autolyse, about 200 grams of it. So I've got our kitchen scale here. Just going to pour it right in. Now we're just going to, grabbing and pinching, combine our starter with our autolyse. Basically just keep doing this. Pinch, pull, until the sourdough starter is fully incorporated into the autolyse. I've been doing a little bit more research into the question as to whether or not the wild yeast found on the outside of a juniper berry is going to produce something all that different from the wild yeast that you'll just find in the air and the flour itself. Because again, you can make a sourdough starter by simply combining water and flour, feeding it every day, and just letting the wild yeast that is all around us in the air, in the flour itself, go to work. However, not every strain of wild yeast is the same. There is a pretty specific strain of wild yeast that is effectively the baking sourdough strain, but from what my admittedly light research thus far has revealed, there are thousands and thousands of unique strains and substrains of wild yeast out there, each that can produce a unique flavor of their own. So is it going to be wildly different? No. But could it be different enough to give us something slightly different than just doing water and flour? I like to think maybe. Speaking of which, we're looking good and combined here. So next step is to add some salt and some more water to this and incorporate that. So now we just pinch this again. Just want to make sure that the water and the salt is well combined through this, but we don't need to go super hard. Just gonna cover it with a damp towel and let it rest for about 10 minutes and we'll be right back. Okay, it's been 10 minutes, so now it is time for the lift and fold. I've got my wet hand here, and what we're gonna do here is work the gluten in our dough. Give the bowl a quarter turn and repeat. Lift, drop, quarter turn, repeat. You should start to feel it become more pliable as you work it. Quarter turn, lift. We're gonna do this for about 10 minutes. You can also stand up. Give yourself a little bit more,
This is easier. It's been a little over 10 minutes, and at this point, we're ready to perform the window pane test. Simply grabbing a dollop of dough and seeing if we can stretch it out and see light through it without it starting to break too much. This is where my inexperience really starts to come through right here. Is I am kind of like, is this ready? Is it not? Don't really know. So if you're looking for like a thorough guide and tutorial on truly how to make sourdough the right way, as soon as you're done with this video, just at the top of your search bar there, type in how to make sourdough bread and watch a video from an actual professional baker, because they're gonna show you how to do this the right way. They're gonna show you a perfect loaf at the end. Just fair warning right now, you're watching a video of someone whose sourdough loaves about 50% of the time come out looking like this. We're on a journey here together. And this is a brand new starter. I have not made a single loaf with this starter yet. Truly don't know what we're getting ourselves into. Now we're ready to bulk ferment. This is the stage at which our wild yeast friends are gonna go to work, eating, farting out gases, doing all their stuff, and making us a delicious, chewy, airy, tangy piece of sourdough bread. So, I just like to turn this out into a fresh, new glass bowl. It makes it a little bit easier to monitor the progress of our bulk ferment. If you've only got one bowl, that's fine. You can turn the dough out onto a clean surface, clean the bowl out, and put it back in and just use that one. But we're gonna empty this out into our glass bowl here. And we're gonna keep this in a warm place in our kitchen, cover it with a towel, and it actually helps to mark where we're at. Let's do that real quick with a piece of tape. Boop. Roughly right around there. We're gonna let this sit covered in our kitchen in a warm place for anywhere from 3 to 7 hours. We're gonna mark the time right now, it's 10:36. An hour from now, we're gonna check the progress and we're gonna knock the gases out by doing our lift and fold. Lift, fold, turn, lift, fold, turn, lift, fold, turn 4 times. Knock all that gas out, let it rise back up, and check the progress each hour. And after it's about doubled in size and is looking nice and alive, that's when we know we're done. Here's what we're looking at so far. We'll be back in an hour.
1 hour later and not much action, but still gonna slide a wet hand in there for the old lift and fold, and cover it and just repeat this every hour until now about 7 hours later for me, it was looking like this. Our juniper yeast friends have done their job. It's gassy, full of bubbles up the sides and across the top, and it just looks and feels absolutely alive. Which means now it's time for the secondary ferment. We're gonna empty this dough out onto a floured surface and then cut it in half, shaping each half into a ball and setting them seam side down to rest. And at this point, you've got some options as to what to do next, but a really common thing to do is to form each ball into a loaf shape and let it secondary ferment in a small basket called a banneton. And well, you know me, I can't resist trying to make a banneton of my own out of some Utah juniper wood. I mean, it only seems fitting if we got yeast from juniper berries, let's let this thing finish off in some juniper wood. So I grabbed some of those leftover juniper log pieces that I harvested to make the stade out of and cut them into some thin planks, and then planed them down to about 1 centimeter thick and gave them a good sanding. Then I created a guide consisting of 9 overlapping rings, each about 1 centimeter wide. I printed them out and slapped each of them to a plank of juniper wood so that once they're cut out, I'll have 8 rings and a bottom piece that when all stacked together should leave me with a wooden banneton. After drilling access holes between each ring for the scroll saw blade to fit into, all that was left to do was to start cutting each one, being extra careful here since this super thin wood cuts real fast and this blade kind of wants to wander on me, which hey, it did that a few times, but that's nothing a little sculpting with some hand sanding at the end won't fix. So what does a banneton do exactly? Well, a few things. It helps our dough hold its shape as it rests and proofs a bit further instead of just spreading out all over the place, especially as we let it rest in the fridge for a day or so. Traditionally, bannetons are made out of cane or wicker, which absorbs a little bit of excess moisture from the dough and helps with forming a better textured crust. So what about a banneton made out of juniper wood? Well, I think it should do everything that a cane or wicker one does, but the big question I have is, will this impact the flavor of the bread? I personally doubt it, but this is some highly aromatic wood. As I'm cutting into this, the strong cedary aroma is filling up my garage, and we've already seen on this channel that I really like the taste of cedar flavored wood, so this is something to keep an eye on for sure. Okay, with each ring cut out and sanded to the proper shape, it's time to lightly glue this whole thing together. Give it some clamp time to let that glue set and let it think about how to properly be a banneton. Then oil just the outside, leaving the inside as raw wood. And then I honestly thought the bottom piece could have looked a little bit cooler, so I cut a bunch of little strips, glued those together, pried the original bottom piece off, and glued this new one there instead. And there we have it, a juniper wood banneton. And I'm so much more thrilled with this than I expected to be. It looks really cool, it smells amazing, and we've just doubled the juniperness of our forthcoming loaf of sourdough. Now it's just time to put it to use. Gonna add a healthy dusting of a mix of rice flour and bread flour to the inside of it, then take one of our sourdough balls, fold it up into thirds, roll it up into a loaf shape, and then drop it seam side up into the banneton. Dust the exposed part with some more of our flour mixture, cover, and let it rise at room temperature for about an hour before moving it over to the fridge to rest overnight or up to a couple days. Which means I've finally got some spare time to put our finished Utah Juniper Utah up onto the map. And oh, it looks right at home up there, just gorgeous coloring, that grain, a wonderful ripple of chatoyancy. Feels good to finally have a new state up there after all these months. Okay, moment of truth time. Got the dough out of the fridge, so let's turn the banneton over, and hey, it worked. I love this so much. Honestly, it does kind of smell strongly of juniper wood, but that's to be expected at this stage. So let's go ahead and slice this thing up and then drop it into a Dutch oven that's been heating up in a 500-degree oven. Let it bake with the lid on for 20 minutes, then pull that lid off, lower the temperature to 450, and let it bake for another 30 minutes or more until golden brown. This is exciting and nerve-wracking. Let's remove, let it cool off, and cut into this thing. And hey, that's not too shabby in there. From a bunch of yeast hanging out on some juniper berries to a juniper wood banneton, what we have in our hands here is the world's most juniper-y loaf of sourdough. So let's give it a taste.
So when I pulled this out of the fridge with the dough in it, it smelled very strongly of juniper wood. When I made this thing, I thought there was no way this would actually impart any kind of flavor into the wood. Sourdough is pretty strong already, but at this point, I don't know. Let's find out. You know what? That is delicious. You know, for a beginner, I was real nervous about this. I didn't know how this process would go. I was especially nervous to film it and share it on the internet. You know what, I'll tell you one thing I was definitely right about. The wild yeast that's cool enough to be hanging out on some juniper berries in the middle of the Great Basin, they sure know how to make a mean sourdough. As for the banneton, I don't know if my head's playing tricks on me or what, but I feel like I can kind of taste a little bit of juniper in there after all. I'm gonna say we can at least. And that's it for this episode. Sorry again that it's been such a long delay between states. It's been a pretty hectic few months here. Speaking of which, huge thanks to my patrons and members for helping support me through those months. Truly, your support just by watching this video means the world to me. So let me know in the comments, what state do you want to see next? And importantly, I don't have a name for my sourdough starter yet. It's done a phenomenal job. It's gonna stick around. So let me know in the comments, what should we name this thing? Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and get to eating this entire loaf. Bye now.